Our next speaker is Professor David Murdoch. David Murdoch is the Dean of the University of Otago, Christchurch. He is the co-leader of the Infection Group, the co-director of One Health Aotearoa, a senior associate in the Department of International Health at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, and a clinical microbiologist at Canterbury Health Laboratories. And David, I understand that you also worked on a vaccine for pneumonia. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's right. I mean, not on the manufacture or development of the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, but on its evaluation and implementation, yes.
Wonderful. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about the path to a vaccine for COVID-19. Take it away, David.
Thank you, Kyla, and what a wonderful introduction from Susie. And for those outside New Zealand, just to underscore what a day we've had. So we're all have been very frantically planning for basically 4 weeks of isolation. Or 4 weeks at home. So we're busy looking after our staff and our families, and we have 2 days to plan for that. So if we look a little bit jaded and exhausted, there's a very, very good reason for that. Well, Susie talked about the activities that are going on now and showed very nicely about the reasons why we are working very hard and aggressively with public health measures to get on top of this pandemic. I'm going to look a little more into the future and talk about the path to a vaccine. And of course, this has been a topic of a lot of discussion about the need for a COVID-19 vaccine and how that's going to be a very important part of our response to the pandemic. And indeed, many people believe that is actually the likely exit strategy from this pandemic, what's actually going to put the cap on it in the end. The current focus is obviously on getting on top of this pandemic, really while waiting until that vaccine is developed. So there's some pretty big pressures on the vaccine developers at the moment and a lot of expectation. And if we just look at the role of vaccines in other epidemics, there's certainly plenty of examples where vaccines play a critical role. And some examples for you. Hepatitis A, which is a viral infection causes inflammation of the liver, hepatitis, transmitted through contaminated food and water. And many parts of the world, it's an endemic infection. Many parts of the world, it's not. And in the latter, if there's an outbreak, apart from the good public health measures of related to a contamination of a water source, the vaccine, and there's a very effective vaccine for hepatitis A, and that's often used as part of that response to an outbreak, as well as all the others. In other situations, influenza, that's an epidemic we know happens every year. It's a predictable epidemic, and in that situation, we have a vaccine that we deploy in anticipation of that occurring every year. And then in another situation, sometimes a breakdown in the actual vaccine program of countries has caused outbreaks. And the one that's most obvious recently is measles, where this is a really important childhood infection, obviously can infect adults, where we have a very effective vaccine that's made a huge difference globally. But now in places where the vaccine program has broken down for one reason or another, we've had some breakthrough outbreaks, and they've been quite big. And here's a situation where actually getting the vaccine program back on task has actually helped to resolve those outbreaks. So we're more like the hepatitis A situation here with COVID. We've got a disease. We want to really get on top of this pandemic. The problem, of course, is we don't have a vaccine at the moment. And so there's a lot of activity directed towards that development. My understanding at the moment is there are about 35 different vaccine candidates that are in various states of development and evaluation. Obviously, not all of them are likely to come to market. And some of them understand that the clinical trials are going to start very soon. In fact, there's some that the clinical trials may have already started. And I think that's those two facts, the fact that we have about 35 different candidates, roughly, that have been evaluated, and the fact that clinical trials are starting already is amazing when you think about that 4 months ago we didn't even know this virus existed. So that is quite extraordinary. And as I may touch on later, that's a little different from the past, where the typical time to market for a vaccine has been 10, 15 years. It's taken a long time. But I think it's important to put it into context and not, the fact is that we're still away from actually having an effective vaccine. We're also, and in fact, by the best estimates, we're still probably 12 or 18 months away from, if everything went well, from actually having that vaccine ready and available. So we've got some time to go, especially considering that we've got to this stage after only a few months. 12, 18 months is still some time away. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of the prospects for those vaccines, the specific details of those vaccines, and I think someone else actually may be discussing that later in this event. What I'm going to focus on is why it takes 12 or 18 months, which still is extraordinarily short compared to what it used to be. But why does it take so long? What is the path to get there? What is the complex process that we have to go through to get a vaccine that is able to be implemented and delivered? So just put the first slide. There are typically about 6 phases in the development of a vaccine, and the first phase is typically called the exploratory phase. This is the phase where scientists come up with ideas, and just as a reminder, what a vaccine is. A vaccine is introducing into the body either part or whole of the bacteria or virus we're trying to develop a vaccine against. It's in a form that shouldn't be harmful to the person receiving that vaccine. And the idea is that introducing that part of that microorganism, virus or bacterium, that it will invoke in a person an immune response. And so, and that immune response has some memory. So in other words, it develops that response, it's retained by the body, and if that person was exposed to the real infection at a subsequent time, that it would remember it and would react to it and would prevent disease occurring. So this exploratory phase is when the ideas come up. Is this a target for the vaccine? Is this the right part of this virus, in the case of COVID, which to target for a vaccine? And in fact, when very shortly after the outbreak was recognized, the organism that caused the virus, which we call SARS-CoV-2, that causes COVID-19, when it was first discovered, that information was released very quickly onto the very transparently to the global community. And so that information about the structure of that virus, about the genetics of it, was released very quickly. And so immediately scientists were looking at it and saying, well, look, these are the ideas that we have for a vaccine. So that was happening very early on. The next stage we often call the preclinical phase. So this is actually, once you've got the idea, let's get some early ideas about, actually, is it going to work? Potentially, is it going to be harmful? And other 2 critical issues that we are faced with throughout the development of vaccines. And this is the stage where typically in the lab, there are experiments with cells, live cells that are grown in the lab, or sometimes in animal studies, actually looking at, is there evidence that it in fact is going to work in inducing an immune response? And also, is it going to be harmful? So there's a lot of information gathered at that time. I'm just checking that we're getting all of the slides on the screen. I think we are, yes. And the next phase is a phase we go to clinical development. And in fact, a lot of vaccines don't actually pass this test and get through to, they often fail at the preclinical stage, either because it's just no evidence that they're working, or else they've caused some harm in those laboratory-based studies. If they look promising, they'll go to the next stage, which is that of clinical development and clinical evaluation. This is a pretty big stage, requires a lot of funding. Usually the preclinical phase, there is industry sponsorship at that stage. The clinical evaluation phase, the clinical development phase, absolutely does. And in that phase, this is where all the clinical trials go on. It's really determining, does the vaccine work? Is it going to cause any harm? Is it safe, in other words? And actually what doses, how should it be given? Is it given in just one dose enough? Does it need to have multiple doses? What are those doses? And we typically divide this stage into phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 studies. So you often hear those terms, you know, phase 1 studies happening, phase 2 study, progressing to phase 3. They're all required for vaccine development typically. And in fact, the whole process of entering this time of clinical development is very tightly controlled. The regulatory bodies are engaged very early on. They approve the protocols, just making sure that the studies are all conducted in the right manner and ethically. So often getting the ethics involved and the right ethics is obviously crucial. Nowadays, this is actually the stage that is the rate limiting step in the vaccine development. It used to be the stages as well, the earlier stages, where now the technology has improved that. Nowadays, it's actually more of the clinical evaluation, having the time to enable the right studies to be, clinical studies to be performed. So phase 1 study, there's typically less than 100 healthy volunteers, and that would be, the goal is really just to get an early idea about the development of an immune response if these healthy subjects are given this candidate vaccine. It may also give some idea about are there any safety as well, are there any harms with that. If it passes the test, that will go to a phase 2 study, and that would typically be in the order of hundreds of healthy participants. And at this it goes through a very similar process, typically looking again at the immune response, again at safety, but getting a better idea about dosage, in particular in phase 2 studies. Progress to phase 3 studies, and these are the very big studies, thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people. And the typical design, it would be a placebo-controlled trial where there'd be a large number of participants, and some of the participants, typically half of them, would be randomly selected to have either the vaccine or a placebo or an alternative. But basically, it's comparing the candidate vaccine to a placebo. And participants don't know what they're receiving, and therefore it's looking over time, looking at who develops the infection in question. In this case, it would be COVID-19, and then compare once the study's finished, looking at the proportion that get COVID-19 among those who got the vaccine, among those who didn't get the vaccine. And hopefully, with a vaccine that worked, you'd see that there would be very little, if any, among those who were vaccinated, and you'd see a number of cases among those who received the placebo. So these studies at the moment will be planned in places which have, for the COVID vaccine, where there is ongoing transmission of COVID. So there are plenty of places in the world, sadly, at the moment where this sort of study could potentially be conducted. So ultimately, as I said, at this stage, we'll know, is it safe, does it work, and what sort of doses can be given. Very expensive, so there's a lot of money to conduct all the trials in this stage. If it passes the muster, if it looks like a good vaccine that works and is safe, it will then go through a whole lot of checks with the various regulators. In the US, it's typically the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, but there are others, and it will go through that process, just making sure it meets all the requirements for a effective and safe vaccine. And then would progress to manufacturing. And this almost always would involve industry, obviously, the ability to mass produce vaccine in numbers and volumes enough to vaccinate target population. That's a big undertaking in a very specialist area. So, and thought needs to be given to that very early on. There's no point in developing a vaccine if there's some issues with manufacture, either technical or just in terms of the capacity. That needs to be thought through very early on. And then ultimately, quality control, just knowing that it's a vaccine that can be stored, that it can be delivered, that it actually is having the impact that it's supposed to have. And so ongoing monitoring is really, really critical as the vaccine is deployed. Now, this is a typical 6 stages of vaccine development, but actually that's not the end. And in fact, there are a lot of other factors that have to be taken into consideration. And just to actually move the vaccine from the development stage into the implementation phase, there are many other steps that have to happen. And I'm imagining that that's probably going to be a fairly straightforward process, one would hope, with if we ever get an effective COVID vaccine, because the desire to get this vaccine and to deploy it in countries is very high and is probably likely to remain high given the extent of this pandemic. But for a typical vaccine, there are many other factors that need to be taken into consideration. The need to involve, and these are typically at a country level. Does the Ministry of Health of a country, are they supporting it, and the World Health Organization and other government agencies? Is there actually is the burden of that infection deemed to be important in that country or not? Is it worth implementing the vaccine? Is the vaccine, it might be developed in Europe or North America, but does it actually apply to other parts of the world? Is it equally effective in those countries? What is the funding? That's a big issue. A lot of the burden of many infectious diseases often falls disproportionately onto poor countries. Vaccines have traditionally been relatively cheap interventions. Some of the more recent vaccines are actually quite sophisticated and are actually quite expensive. So this is a big issue, and the very creative funding mechanisms have developed around the world to support particularly developing countries to make sure these important vaccines get implemented. How do you deliver them? Some countries, the logistics are quite challenging, and then often just to evaluate after implementation. And just to give an example of a vaccine that I've been involved in, that was the implementation of the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine into Nepal. And that's a low-income country that with a high burden of pneumonia in children, and the pneumococcal vaccine is a vaccine against one of the most important causes of childhood pneumonia. And so, but a very expensive vaccine, a vaccine that was developed in wealthy countries, that was designed to cover the type of bacteria, the strains that are in the wealthy countries, but where most of the benefit will probably be in poorer countries. So this was an important vaccine. And the stages that we went through in that process in supporting, leading to the implementation involved obviously the engagement and the relevant government officials and support from them who initiated the interest, and were important that they were supportive throughout the process. It was important to actually document that pneumococcal disease, this type of pneumonia, was important in the country. So there had to be those studies just simply demonstrating, yes, like other countries, it was important. And then was the vaccine the right one? Looking at the strains of the bacteria that caused pneumonia, yes, they were the strains in the vaccine, so that was important. The funding, and obviously there are issues, as I mentioned, about how we get the funding. And Nepal is a country that is eligible for support from the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunisation, so that was really good to have that ability to fund the vaccine. Logistics for delivery, this is a country that's very mountainous, and just needed to know how to maintain what we call the cold chain, how to keep the vaccine cold at the right temperature right out to where it was delivered. And then we're currently involved in evaluating the impact of the vaccine once it was actually approved by the government to be part of the normal immunisation schedule. Now, a lot of that, as I said, won't necessarily apply to COVID-19, because I think this is one that will likely be fast-tracked if we get an effective vaccine. But it's important to understand the various stages that go through and why it takes so long to get a vaccine to market. I thought I'd just end also by just mentioning which I've touched on already, the issue of equity and inequity when it comes to vaccines. And of course, that's already a concern with COVID-19. Obviously, we all want an effective vaccine, but once one is developed, will it be going to all the countries and all areas of the world that need it? And there are a number of entities around the world at the moment that are really focused on that. An important one is the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, which was really established in about 2015 to help fund particularly vaccines, but other innovations and to really ensure that equity issue was dealt with up front. And so CEPI is the acronym for that organisation is behind a lot of, as I understand it, some of the vaccines that are currently under development. Kyla, I think I'll leave it there, and very happy to answer any questions about vaccines.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. And I am going to welcome Susie back as well. Susie, good to see you. We've got you unmuted as well. And David, I'll invite you to stop sharing your screen so that we've got the three of us here. And I'm going to start with a question for you, David. Is there any reason to be concerned that we would not have a vaccine in 12 to 18 months? Is that possible, or is the path very clear?
The path isn't very clear, and I think vaccines have come a long way now, but no, there is still a lot of uncertainty. Vaccine development, there's still a reasonable amount of trial and error. Hopefully those that will have a fair idea, those that are going to clinical trials, we should have some evidence that they're working. So that's a good sign to know that they are progressing that far. But yeah, there's a lot of wait and see.
I did see, I know we have Larry Brilliant speaking in about 18 hours. And I saw an interview with him recently in Wired where he said there was nothing in the virology that led him to believe that it was particularly complicated. Is that your understanding as well? That's
what I'm told as well. And yes, so we hope that's true. We really do hope it's true. So I'm optimistic. A lot of very clever people working on this at the moment.
And another question that I have is, I have heard, I don't know the exact terminology, but it's something like compassionate use or something, where in a case like this, where we have such a critical crisis and the need is so great to get the vaccine to the population that potentially you can apply it for certain people before it's even gone through those clinical trials. Is that a thing, or have I made that up?
No, I mean, that's probably more applied to some of the drugs, and often drugs that are, some countries find very expensive, and so that there may be, there may be the early ability to access those drugs, but they would have still gone through all of the safety and effectiveness trials. Vaccines probably, this is more on a population basis, so rather than individual. So it's the kind of equivalent of a compassionate use would be that looking at the socioeconomic status of the country and the ability to afford the vaccine.
Got it. And just one more question for you before I turn to you, Susie. And we'll come back to you as well, David, and both of you feel free to chime in at any point. But once we have a vaccine, do you have any kind of estimate for how long it would take? You talked about the manufacturing and distribution process. To get something manufactured and distributed globally, as would be necessarily the case with COVID-19, do you have a sense of the length of that process?
No, but I'm just constantly surprised at how things have come along. And I think, the Ebola outbreak in West Africa a few years ago, that really pushed on technology. It's a bit like wars, you know, the outbreaks will push on, you know, advanced technology faster than would otherwise. And certainly that was quite impressive how quickly vaccines were evaluated there. So I'm constantly surprised, and I know that there's been a lot of effort to be able to step up. So you know, hopefully that will be we'll see a fairly quick process.